So let's look at a particular way of styling elements in CSS. And what I'm really going to be talking about today are blocks and boxes. So let's imagine a sort of standard HTML document that looks a bit like this. Then we know that what we do is we mark up the document by adding HTML elements into it. So for example, we've got an H1 and a couple of H2s and some paragraphs. And those paragraphs, we've got an image, a link, something like that, and an unordered list with list items that are being indicated with with bullet points. Well, let's have a quick look at the source here. You can see what we've done is we've got markup around the green text. Now what we're actually doing by placing markup into that document is we're obviously indicating a logical structure. And as well as providing a logical sort of structure down the document, what we're actually really doing is we're dividing the document into these blocks, these elements, these block elements. And you can visualize them as being kind of squares, sort of invisible squares, invisible blocks. So let's just go back to the HTML. You can visualize, let's imagine that the HTML is our first block, if you like. So by declaring that a document is an HTML document, we put HTML tag at the top, and we put an HTML closing tag at the bottom. And what we've really done is we've created this kind of block, this square, and inside that block, we will place other blocks. So, for example, here's our body block here. So you could visualize that as being a block inside the block. So the body block is sort of inside the HTML block. Here it is. And we could carry on thinking about the way that the placement of the HTML elements creates blocks within blocks. So have a look at the H1s and the paragraphs. You can see that basically we've got some sub blocks, if you like. They are blocks, squares. And what we're doing is we're placing these in sequence inside the body block. So I've highlighted them here. Now, here's an interesting one. Have a look at this anchor, of course. Now, the thing about this anchor tag is that's residing inside that complete paragraph. So the anchor block is inside the paragraph block, which is inside the body block. So you can see how you get this kind of series of blocks, and each one is inside another block, and you sort of stack them up like that. Here's an image block, and then here's an unordered list, and here are the list items. Now, blocks are the way for us to actually sort of visualize how an HTML page is laid out. And in the original definition for the way that blocks should be laid out inside a page, blocks fall into two types. There are what are described as block level elements, and there are inline elements. So what are the difference between these two different types? So let's have a look at block level elements. Block level elements are laid out vertically inside the containing block. So just think about that for a moment. That means that block level elements are laid sort of down the page inside the containing block. So for this page, we could visualize that this is the actual containing block, and the block level elements, the ones which are laid down the page, they're laid out vertically. So for example, here's an H1 and here's an H2. The reason that the H2 falls and is displayed below the H1 is that H1 and H2 are block level elements. So when they are placed inside the containing block, they are placed vertically. In other words, they run down the page, down the screen. Here's a paragraph. Again, that's a block level element. It's why they're laid like this, down the page. You can see the same thing applies with the H2 and the other paragraph. Inline elements then are elements which are laid out horizontally in the containing block. So block level elements are laid vertically from top to bottom. Inline elements are laid out horizontally in the containing block. So, for example, this is a paragraph here, and we've got some items inside there. We've got an anchor and we've got an image. And if you look at how they're laid out, they are laid out horizontally, in other words, from left to right, inside the containing block. So when we put the anchor into a paragraph, when we put a link into a paragraph, it doesn't create a sort of carriage return, line return. It's actually embedded inside the paragraph. Similarly then, an image by default is an inline element inside the containing block. And we can go through the actual HTML elements, and they fall into these two categories. Some of them are block level elements and some of them are inline elements. Now I'm fudging it a bit here because list and list items it's a little bit more complicated, but I just want to talk about the general idea here, which is that some elements are naturally laid down the page and some elements are naturally laid across the page depending upon the containing block. So what can we actually do with blocks in CSS? Well, there's a whole bunch of different properties. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to change the nature of these invisible blocks. We can change the way that the block is actually displayed, and what that actually means is changing whether it's a block level element or an inline element. We can float a block, so it actually just drifts to the left or to the right. We can clear space next to a block, so we could say absolutely nothing should be on the left of this block or to the right of this block. Or we can treat a block as a box, and when we treat a block as a box, what that actually enables us to do is to actually change the visual aspects of it. So we could change the border colour, we can set the border and things like that, and I'll talk about that one later on. But let's have a look at these first three. So let's look at the display property, and what display does is it basically enables us to say that something is inline or block or none. I think the easiest way to do this is just to do it with a quick demonstration. So here's my empty style sheet, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the H1. So here's my style rule, display : none. Now what if you have a look at the H1, what we're actually saying is don't display the H1. That's one of the values that display can actually have. We can say none, and if we do that, what actually happens is the H1 simply disappears. Now all that's happened is that the browser is taking the instruction not to display the H1, just like that. We could take the image and we could go display is none, and in which case, just like that, the image would disappear. We could change the way that a element is displayed by changing the nature of it. So we know that anchors are inline elements. Well, what we could do is we could say that any anchors will actually be block level elements. So have a look at the link which is in the first paragraph. If we say display is block for an anchor, then what we're actually saying is that this will be displayed vertically inside the surrounding block. Now the surrounding block is the paragraph here, so that link will be displayed vertically. So what will happen is this. So let's look at some of the other things we can do. We can float an element. We can float it to the left or float it to the right. And what will happen is it will float until its edge touches another block. Now it could also touch the edge of the containing block. Here's the float property. We can go left, right, we can go none. Again, let's have a look at an example. So let's take the image. Now currently you can see that the image just doesn't have any distinct file. We know it's an inline element. So what I could do is I could go float to the right. And what that will do is that will detach the image from here and float it as far as it can go to the right. And in this instance, it would go over here. Note how all the elements which were below flow up the page to occupy the space where the image was before. So you can see how, if I just go back a bit, you can see how Common Browsers now has actually floated up to fill up that space when the image flows to the right. We could take the image and we could float it to the left. So there we go. The image just drifts over to the left until it hits the edge of the containing block. And you can see again, you can see how Common Browsers in that paragraph flow up. This time they flow up on the right hand side. Well, let's have a look at the clear property, and what the clear property says, it says make space on the side of an item so nothing actually fills that space up. So again, let's do an example. So we float the image to the right. So if you watch the image, that image flows to the right. And now, as we've indicated, what will happen here is when that image flows to the right, all the elements below that sort of float up the page. Well, now what we could do is we could say float that image to the right, but the H2, nothing is to appear on the right of the H2. So if we do that, watch what happens. There we go. You can see that by applying that rule, of course, the H2 naturally is pushed down the page because nothing has to appear on the right hand side of it. Now the next thing that you can do is you can actually style the blocks as if they were boxes. So you can actually change the actual visual appearance of a block. And I'll talk about that in the next video.